NWP Radio.
You're listening to NWP Radio, a production of the National Writing Project.
NWP. NWP Radio.
Hello and greetings. Welcome to Beyond Storytime CoLab, making and sharing our COVID stories. I'm Christina Cantrell from the National Writing Project, and I'm coming to you today from my home office here in Philadelphia. I'm really excited to have colleagues to talk with tonight about two of my favorite activities, making and storytelling. So as we get this show started, why don't we do a round of introductions, and I'll pass it to you, Sandra, so you can introduce yourself.
Hello, greetings from Louisville, Kentucky. I am Sandra Hogue, and I am affiliated with the Louisville Writing Project here in Kentucky. And I'm coming to you from my basement NTI space, and I am thrilled to be with you. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Claudia Logan. I'm a educator and children's book author, and coming to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Hey everybody, my name is Margo. I am coming to you today from Greenfield, Massachusetts, on the other end of the state from Claudia. I am a public history professor at Salem State University, and I'm happy to be here with you all.
Yay, I'm so excited. Thank you all for being here. So I want to just take a moment. We're going to do something fun tonight. We're going to we each have brought some artifacts that we want to share with you when thinking about making and sharing stories about experiences in the last year. But I want to just give a little bit of background about this sort of collab series that we're doing and what this is part of. So back in, I guess, March and April, when the global pandemic hit the United States and schools started to close, we heard from a couple of members of our Writers' Council, and Claudia Logan is one of the members of our Writers' Council here tonight, and another member of our Writers' Council is K-Fi Steele. And both of them were wondering, how do we think about this moment? Like, what can we do together as authors and writers and educators as our whole worlds are shifting and changing around us? And we knew that, things weren't going to continue as normal, so how do we sort of think about what the opportunities were really in this sort of moment of unknown shift and stress, and how could we think about working together as colleagues, working together to continue to support young writers in being, creative and agents of their own work and worlds during this time. So we kicked off a conversation, and this conversation started and brought authors together, children's book authors and illustrators primarily, with educators to think about what was possible and what we might do. Out of these conversations, a range of ideas surfaced, and we can actually share with you, along with this broadcast, we'll share a link to some of the previous conversations that we've also had. But one of the ideas that came out of this conversation was to really, how do we support writers in actually writing about what's happening right now, what they're experiencing? How do we support them in sharing it and making sure that they have those opportunities to process what we're all going through and what they're going through? So we wanted to kick off this discussion, and now it's actually a whole year later, and there's all these things that have been created over this last year, and we also know there's so many still stories to be told, and so many ways that we can support writers that we work with to continue to process their experience, to share their work, to tell their stories, to share what they're creating and making. And we're really in a new transition point again, right? Sandra at the beginning of the show was talking, before we started recording, was talking about how they're returning to school next week. So, you know, we're really in this moment of sort of reimagining what is possible when we're not sort of, you know, talking through these computer screens and, you know, with each other, get in spaces. What can we share? What can we bring to talk about our experience, the process experience, and support each other and support our writers specifically. So that's really what we're here to talk about today. And we want to really just we decided, you know, let's just bring some things that we've been working on, that we've been thinking about, but that we've been making with our families and with our with writers that we've been working with colleagues, with friends, and think about what we've learned in this moment and what we've learned from these creations that we've put together. And then what are the implications? What are the implications for us as educators? What are the implications for us as community members, etc. Okay. So each of us is going to have a chance to share an artifact, and I brought one too. And we're going to share, just spend a couple minutes. I'll put up a slide and we'll share what we brought. Spend a couple minutes describing it, thinking about something that we've learned or gleaned from it. And then once all of us have a chance to share, then we'll talk across. Okay. So let me get the screen. And anything, I want to just ask everybody real fast before I share this one, anything anybody wants to add? Good, okay, great. All right, so I will share this artifact that I brought. And they're really two things, but they kind of go together. And so at the beginning of so this is a doll, basically, and then the head of a puppet, you know, like it's supposed to have a whole body, but it's really just the head. And and the doll is named Beverly, and she's made by an artist in Collingswood, New Jersey. And the puppet head is made by me. It's supposed to be the head of a stick grasshopper. So I made him at the beginning of the pandemic. And Beverly was a doll that I had in my house that I was sort of keeping at my house because she's made by an artist and kind of special, but my niece really, really loved her. And so she would come over and play with her and talk to her and hang out with her. And my niece lived down the block prior to the pandemic. But right before the pandemic, my niece and my partner's sister and her kids, so my niece and her brother, moved outside the city. So they weren't down the street anymore. And then suddenly the pandemic hit, right? And Beverly is still at my house. And so we started FaceTiming with Beverly. And then at that point I had Stick too. So I introduced Stick. And suddenly like Beverly and Stick were like she wanted to talk to them all the time, right? We just had these regular calls. And if Beverly showed up and Stick wasn't there, she's like, "Where's Stick?" And Stick showed up, Beverly, "Where's Beverly?" And so like we sort of all became this sort of one group. And we would, you know, meet and talk and share. And it just made me, and it, you know, it became this sort of regular ritual that we had that I found so important for me, and I also believe important for her. So the words that I was thinking about was friends and FaceTime and family, and also sort of like just thinking about alliterations like connecting, creating, and companions. And I was thinking about how they really helped us stay connected during a time of, you know, huge change and disconnection. and that we sort of kept creating stories and narratives, stories and narratives about their relationship to each other, and stories and narrative about our relationships to each other. So I feel like these are an important piece of my experience I want to share. So Sandra, I'm going to pass it to you.
Sorry, it's sometimes finding that mute button. I started to briefly panic because I thought I was not going to be able to click it in time. Good evening. I so enjoyed hearing about your niece and that relationship that you built with them. So thank you for sharing that. The artifact that I brought this evening is one that is near and dear to my heart. I am, in my dissertation work, used as data collection, photo voice. Everyone has a camera, everyone's on social media. I'm guilty of, according to my family, overposting on social media. So I'm always taking, capturing images of our day-to-day activities. And so when the pandemic hit, things didn't change at all, right? So I was using images to placehold the experiences my children and I were having. Now, I have two very different children. I have an 11-year-old who is a social butterfly and needs interactions with others to help her feel complete. And then I have a son who is plagued by anxiety and is a special needs learner. And so their needs are very different. But what I found to be very important was that we used this photo voice, or this opportunity of the pandemic, to placehold what was happening in our lives. So a bit about photo voice. It allows the kiddos the process, anyone who utilizes it, to serve as archivists, right? To serve as primary sources and reporters of things that are happening in their lives. And so it felt like a natural fit. Part of the conversation I had with my children was the fact that they are serving as primary sources of the events in this pandemic, which was difficult for my son to wrap his mind around. But I said, your grandchildren will be able to look back on this date and see what you did, right? To see the experiences and what you felt and thought about what was happening on this day and time. And so we embarked on this journey of utilizing these images to capture artifacts of the pandemic. And so in the photo voice process, with the way I utilize it, we use the images, we have them processed in the old school way at the local photo shop. But then I encourage the creation of a museum-like artist placard to accompany each of those images. So text and the images come together to communicate the reality of the person, that personal experience, right, in the moment. And so what you see on the screen on the slide deck are artifacts, just a few. We have probably 100, if not more, of these at this point. But for each of them, my kiddos gave each piece a title and provide the viewer, if you will, of the art to understand the events as they were happening through the writing that accompanies the title for the piece. And so this is just, like I said, an example, a sample of the photo voice artifacts that my kiddos and I have captured. We even took that further and moved it into what might it look like to turn these into pieces of poetry. And so my daughter and I especially played with that notion. So we visited, mentor text and poetry, and found a poetry form that she really liked. She fell in love with the list poem. And so she converted this photo voice artifact into a poem, right? So that genre switch. But what we'll have here is a collection that allows my kiddos to be the primary sources of what has taken place in our lives and in the city and in the state and in the country during this pandemic. And so for us, it has served as social emotional, right? Some processing of the things that are happening to us that we cannot control. And there are celebrations. We've done things like joy spotting. So we're intentional about finding things to celebrate, which is what you'll see in most of these here. But then there are also, the ones that capture the anxiety when my mother was in the hospital and we couldn't visit with her, or not being with friends, for my daughter who is a social butterfly, for the fact that I live in Louisville, Kentucky, the home of Breonna Taylor, and how all of that has been unfolding in the past year. So it has really been um, therapeutic for us to serve as archivists, to place hold and to capture and to help us process in social emotional ways, things that are happening for us during the pandemic. But it will also serve, once again, the broader community as we share this material with the world. And so that's our story of photo voice. That's the artifact I brought to share with you today. And so I'll pass it along to our colleague, Claudia, I do believe is next.
Thank you, Sandra. That was actually so perfect because you touched on a lot of the same themes that I have been thinking about over the last year. And the minute basically that it became clear the pandemic was going to be very serious and broad ranging, I sort of went into my sort of historian, researchy, writery brain and thought, how are we going to document this? What are we going to document about this? And it really hit me that we were the primary sources suddenly, and that it was an opportunity to really see how this story was going to be told, and who makes up narratives, and how history itself is kind of built, and that really became the sort of fascinating sort of idea for me. It's strange to look back now a year later and think about all the things that have happened over this past year, how it was more than the pandemic, as if that wasn't enough. And just the idea that we were sharing something on a global level was enormous. And then so many other events emerged. I work at a school, Shady Hill in Cambridge, and as soon as we closed, a kind of desperation took hold of all of us, and we wanted to find ways to connect with students who were sometimes there and sometimes not, and with each other. And I was trying to find something kind of funny that maybe we could do. And I discovered by chance that you could, in fact, mail a potato through the post office. And there's 6 items, basically, that the post office will allow you to do. Send something without having to put it in any kind of package or envelope. And I thought that was kind of great. And I went to the post office, very, very long line, very unhappy people seeing me with my little potato. People became even unhappier when the clerk had to go in the back and discuss whether, in fact, this was doable, which it was. And it was an interesting time to be at the post office because there was this sort of rush to mail things to people, and you could feel the panic that people were feeling, and a way of sort of trying to connect with people in their lives. And it was when sort of shortages of things were beginning, and so it was not business as usual. It was also one of the few places at that point that was still open. In any case, 6 weeks passed before this potato arrived, and they were not happy weeks. Things were getting grimmer on a large scale, and in terms of my own life and my family's life, it just felt like everything was so difficult, and it was just so hard to sort of have any feeling of success or anything going smoothly or anything mattering at all. It was pretty hard. And out of the blue, I got this text from my colleague, Alita, And the potato indeed arrived. And I had almost forgotten about it. And it really felt at that moment like a small victory in all of this. And when I look at it, I'm really reminded of that time. But what is interesting to me as well is the sort of intersection between our stories and what's happening on a larger sort of platform in the world. And who knew that the post office would later become such an important part of the election? And when mailer voter mail-in became such a contentious issue. And so it's very interesting to me when you have your little story about something, this artifact in this case, and then you start to see how some piece of it becomes part of the larger story in a way that you might not have predicted or you might have predicted. So that was really interesting to me. But it also is a strange thing to think about how these artifacts really represent a time for all of us when we really had to go inwards, and yet the events that were going on in the world were dominating everything. And suddenly we really were living history, and the news was truly important because it really did affect how we were living and what was going to happen. And so there was this sort of constant clash between being in these tiny little pods and this storm raging outside. And so that's the piece that I think about a lot. And also how the idea that although we are sharing an event, a global pandemic, we are not experiencing it in the same way. We are not experiencing some of the other major events that transpired the same way. And so these stories really show how the narrative, depending on who's telling it, that changes what history, means in the long haul. And for me, that was a very, very interesting sort of idea to grapple with, that you could have even something like a mask mean so many different things to different people. And so all of this sort of had double meanings for me. It was my personal artifact, but I could also see how it sort of could play out. And to me, that remains a very interesting thing to think about as we share our stories and try to sort of find common ground and also see the different parts of this experience that the artifacts reveal. So there is my potato story. And I will pass it to a real historian now.
We're all historians. This works really well, actually. I'm excited to be able to follow Claudia's story. So a year ago on Thursday, so in 2 days, it will have been a year since I shared a classroom with students in bricks and mortar space. And we were kind of riotous. It was right before spring break, and we were debating whether or not COVID was really going to be a big thing. And I was certain that it was, and a bunch of students were certain that it wasn't. And other folks were scared, and we were just kind of processing this. And I put on a video that I had seen of this Italian grandma. And the Italian grandma she was kind of iconic of how folks in Italy and Spain who were a little bit ahead of us in terms of their experience of the pandemic were facing it. And so she was sort of, she was like both really profound and also really comic. And so she said, "We can't touch each other anymore, so we're just gonna wink." And she like did this big wink, and they kind of had a sound effect that went with it. And then she was like, you don't sneeze into your hand anymore. You have to sneeze into your elbow. And she would do that. And then she started to say, like, if people are lonely, are you lonely? We'll send you a package. Are you up north where you can't get any food? We'll send you a package. And there was this kind of like, we're gonna take care of you. We don't know how, we don't know the rules, we don't know how long this is gonna be, but we're gonna send you a package. And somehow that was something that I internalized very early on in the pandemic as an individual. And so in my personal life, I sort of became very obsessed with cooking for people. I cooked for strangers and left food at their houses. There was a mutual aid kind of virtual bulletin board. I baked cookies for students who were going to miss graduation and sent them to them. And I ultimately kind of became involved with a project called Historians Cooking the Past that I invited my students to participate in. And it involved cooking a family recipe, sharing a recipe, and then writing an essay about sort of that food or that experience around food in relation specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was through all of these things that I really started to think about what both Sandra and Claudia, I think, have kind of touched on, which is that, like, looking at an object and choosing how you see it is part of this moment. Like that, our experiences are multivalent. They look really different depending on where you're standing. The objects themselves sort of have different stories to tell. Historians love to talk about the witnessing object, right? And we sort of think about the object as witness to history. But what I've learned, especially through engaging with students around writing about food and ritual during the pandemic, is that you kind of need the reflection. And the storytelling is not necessarily predictable. It's not necessarily related to the object or the product at all. And that's something that's been really interesting to learn as an historian and to think about as an historian. But I also just want to say that for me, the rolling pin became a link to the outside world, not just a connection, but also to political activism. The photo that's on the right of me with the rolling pin ran in my local paper because I ended up doing major virtual fundraisers to raise money for the Movement for Black Lives, for anti-gerrymandering campaigns. I got other folks involved in bake sales where they could raise money for things that were important to them, things that enabled us to transcend the kind of restrictions of the pandemic, and to also say that the things that we care about in the world and the injustices that we want to change didn't stop because this virus restricted our movements and our actions. And so again, there's another valence, another way of looking and thinking that maybe I wouldn't have come to if I hadn't had opportunities to reflect, to talk, and to write. So that's sort of how I make these connections.
Oh, so wonderful. Thank you all. We're going to now just sort of do what I'd like us to do is just do a process of sort of noticing and wondering. So what do you notice when you hear these stories, and what does it make you wonder about? So since I have the talking stick, I'll just say that one thing I was thinking about was I was noticing and remembering from your stories sort of some of the global nature of this. There was something about the different ways you told your stories that really embedded me in that multifaceted and the hugeness of this, and it's sort of boundarylessness in that way, that there's just so much going on. As I started to also notice, I was thinking about the way you talked about objects, and Margo was making me think about, like, I often think about performing objects. So I brought, these sort of dolls, and thinking about how objects perform in our lives and how we perform them, and that sort of relationship, and it made me also think about the way, like, your daughter's remixing, Sandra, like she's taking her work and then bringing it into another form, and really like playing with the different ways that her story can be told. It's not just this one way, it's like these multiple possibilities, and sort of the play that's part of that, and the sort of object, the ways that we perform too. I was also, I was thinking, Claudia, your object takes on a whole new thing. Like, I just never thought of a potato in that way, of course. but also, like when it comes to writing and documenting, the ways that like our performances, create these interlocking narratives, I guess, is sort of what I was noticing. Sandra, do you want to pick up on some noticing and some wonderings?
Sure. Thank you, Claudia. A couple of things bubble up for me. One thread that I feel like I felt throughout all four of the stories behind each of these artifacts was the therapy and the healing, if you will, that we found in the creation of these artifacts for us personally, and how that's only one purpose that these will serve, right? They'll serve as markers in history for as long as someone is willing to preserve them. But the first benefit, and I think it's critically important for us right now, is that sense of healing that each of these is providing for us, that little bit of hope, that little bit of joy in such a dark time. And so that's one thing I noticed. And another thing I noticed really piggybacks on something Margo said, which was how each of these artifacts could be perceived differently depending on who's beholding them, right? And that reminds me of refractive phenomenology, which is, a methodology of looking at, and if you think about refraction, picture a straw in a glass of water, and how it looks one way above the water, and then in the water it shifts, but it's still a straw, right? All in all, you rip it out, it's a straw. But what we see depends on the angle and all these other factors, right? The light source and et cetera. And so when I think about critical literacy, and something I'm trying to do, and a movement I'm trying to establish here in my district, which is that critical consumption of information, and how important it is that we not just take, for example, we're examining the Boston Tea Party and looking at how the colonists decided to dress as natives as they pitched the tea over the side of the ship. And then I start to wonder whose perspective, like what did the natives feel in that moment, right? Witnessing this. That's an account that's not part of what's being shared, but they certainly would have thoughts and ideas about that. And so when I think about the artifacts that we've collected, what we bring to them, and the therapy and the healing that those artifacts bring to us, is only the beginning, right? When others consume these artifacts that we are capturing, they'll bring to them their own perspectives, and that will, I think, enrich their value, make them even richer, increase their value as historical accounts of this space and time in our history. So those two things, once again, that thread of the healing for us personally, but also the value in these artifacts, depending on the perspective of the consumers of these experiences. So yes, so thank you. Claudia?
Yes. So I was struck by a few things too. Also, this idea of material culture, and this idea that Margo talked about, like what what objects can mean, and the fact that we all by chance chose something very personal, that you wouldn't probably find in a pandemic museum, 20 years from now. So I thought that was really interesting in and of itself, that these were all sort of all had real sort of personal resonance. And the sort of theme of geography and community also really hit me, that especially for you, Sandra, you living, in the same place as Breonna Taylor, that is mind-boggling to think about, really, and what that means. And Margo's story about being, an activist in all of this, and really being part of your community. And Christina, your connection with your niece, again, it's just such an interesting sort of juxtaposition of sort of where you live and what that artifact means. I also found it very interesting that that we were all trying to make something. We were all trying to cooking and crafting and photographing, and okay, I don't know that mailing a potato counts, but but the idea of some kind of creative effort in all of this is really, really interesting to me. And I know, in general, that I certainly started taking up all kinds of things that I didn't normally do, and this idea of making things, make things with kids online at school, and how important that felt in during that time, to be cooking or creating something and having something tangible come out of it. So those are sort of some themes that I thought were sort of interesting, that that connected our different stories.
I think that's really beautifully said. And I have a feeling that somehow creativity is about claiming agency, and creativity is also, there's something about the frailty of the human experience and the power of the human experience. And there's something about learning, right? There's also like something about, and I can't tell you how many times I like thought back to like that old Natalie Goldberg kind of beginner's mind, right? When you're back at the beginning, and you don't have preconceptions, and you don't know, and like what that felt like. And I guess like one of the things I noticed that sort of relates to that was Sandra's reflection that she's raising two very different children. And I talked to so many introverts who reminded me that sometimes being out in the world is very uncomfortable. And I talked to so many friends who are raising Black and brown kids and trans kids and kids who struggle with hearing loss, and like kids who speak different languages than their teachers speak. And like there was also a lot of relief about what COVID was taking out of their day-to-day negotiations in the world. And Americans are so, like, we're so pragmatic, and we're so sort of like obnoxiously optimistic, that I really wonder if we will ever make space for the ways in which the pandemic kind of allowed us to have some freedom that's not really built into our ordinary way of being. And it just reminds me of the ways this conversation started, with the discussion about going back to school and who gets to decide and who's making those categorical calls. And the kind of the middle of the night despair that I have right now is, have we learned anything? Right? Have we learned anything? And are we going to be better, or are we just going to be the same, but we shop online more?
Can I add something to that? I think that's a fascinating question, because there's all the very obvious disparities that this has exposed, but there's also a lot of subtle things that I think have been interesting. So there's the friend who decides to, to travel even though you're not supposed to, or the governor who makes X decision instead of Y decision, and I think that idea of agency, when you don't have any, when you really have very little, is such an important theme that's going to come out of that. And I worry about this a lot, that has this, will our experiences make us better, or are we just telling the same story over and over again, that there are people who have been able to kind of outcool the pandemic, and sidestep the hardships and the sacrifices and the difficulties, and then the people who have to experience those, 100-fold more than others. And that is just such an important question, and I wish I had a good answer, but I worry about where we're going, what this story is going to really say.
Let's open up the conversation a bit, and really sort of moving into sort of like, what are the implications of some of the things that we've talked about, but really, like, what are some of the things we think we've learned, right? And so and what might be the implications for when we start to return to schools and institutions, when we continue, some of us are going to continue to work online with our writers and students, and what do we want to bring into those spaces? Like, let's keep going there and imagining this. And these collabs are really an opportunity to imagine this stuff together and invite our colleagues to imagine these things with us, so what do we want to carry forward?
I have a question actually for Margo, which is a historian question, which is, are there any general themes that you could speak to in terms of what happens after a huge event? You have the Industrial Revolution that changed everything in a certain way, but like, is there anything that we can draw from in terms of thinking about what this event can teach us from the past? Is there any, are we experiencing something that's happened before? Is this our Groundhog Day? I'm just curious to know what the sort of precedent for this is, if there is one even.
Yeah, I mean, people have said different things. Some people point to the Spanish influenza of 1918, and then they look at the Roaring '20s and the Harlem Renaissance, and a sort of blurring of boundaries, and a real pushing and with experimentation. And so there's kind of that perspective. Historians also talk about periods at the end of war, right, where the rules have changed, and there aren't new rules yet. So you can talk about, in the United States, you can talk about Reconstruction, you can talk about Paris at the end of the First World War. So there are like, we could be entering into a period where we do have opportunities to rewrite the rules, right? Because things really have changed. And I would say, kind of getting to Christina's point, that maybe we have more power to do that within our workplaces. Maybe we have more power, and we need to claim our power around some of the things that people never would have said we could do before, in terms of day-to-day, kind of how we organize our time and our bodies in space. And now we found out, well, actually we can do those things really well in a different way. So there's, I think that what historians generally would say is, after kind of unprecedented tumult, there is either an opening up or there is a gripping down. And I think that's what we're all afraid of. Are we going to open up, or are we going to grip down? right? Um, and yeah, if it's all parties and, revelry,
Yeah, I
then
know. Right,
yeah,
right. And right now a jury's being chosen for the George
George
Floyd case.
Floyd,
So we're going to be seeing a lot of the sort of fallout and repercussions
yeah,
from so much.
So my heart sank a bit when you guys raised the possibility that we could return to the way things were. Um, that is alarming to me and brings about a great deal of sadness. So much has transpired in the past year. The main thing I learned, back to what Claudia was asking, is how little we control first. Like, even in the progressive age in which we live, with all the technology, with all of the advancements, right, that weren't there in 1918, right? We still have so little control. And so that's something that I learned from this. But the thought of us going back to, the way things have been, um, is alarming to me. I just, and I don't know how much of that is my geography, as you mentioned, being, the home of Breonna Taylor, and having Ahmaud Arbery, and having George Floyd, all of that happen, and the changes that are taking place at the law level here in our city and state, and the call from our chief academic officer in the education sense to say, we don't want what we had before. It was minimally effective at best. And so we do need to pivot. And she is challenging us to do that and expects that of us, right? And so um, there's this groundswell in equity and anti-racist education, and meeting the needs of our kiddos, and looking at them from the assets they bring, as opposed to this deficit mindset, right? So I am not willing to let go of any of that groundswell, right? So within my workspace, I can tell you without a doubt, that's where I'm leaning, that's where I'm pushing. And with the bit of power that I have from my role in this district, I am in full acceleration with that.
And I think we're all like with you. I'm afraid that, like so many things in this country, that things, it's too easy to go back. But I hope we have made some serious inroads and a real awakening. I really hope.
One of the things that I was thinking about, like in sort of discussing and getting ready for this session, is that we came to this idea of bringing artifacts with us, right? And I do wonder, that's one idea I just want to hold on to, is like how these we can invite these kind of storytelling opportunities even in our learning spaces and places, to really even start to get to know each other again. I've been teaching a lot of online teaching. It's kind of meta, but and when it and we were often talking in the fall and the summer about, how do we get to know each other when we're in these online spaces all of a sudden, when we open up in the fall, how are we going to meet the kid? How do we build community? But I would ask us, like, how are we going to build community even when we go back, into these places and spaces where we have shared space together, and continue to think about, like, what are we going to ask? What are we going to bring into those spaces? And how do we help each other surface these stories that we really need to hear from each other, and really need to, and maybe, I think it was Claudia, you talked about how, like, the making and the creating is also so important here, and was like part of all of our stories, and so wondering, like, how to bring those pieces into the mix. So anyway, it's one of the things that I do hold on to when I'm thinking about this, like, how do we, those are moments of joy that we can all sort of bring back together and say, like, oh, look what I made.
you know, I mean, I think like I'm thinking about what you said with what Sandra said in the same, trying to put those onto the same plane, right? Like, so one of the things that's really come up for me around the mask, and the mask as an object lesson, or the mask as a teachable moment. And so there's the idea of the mask as an act of care for others. And then there's the idea of the mask as something that's like holding us back, or something that, like trespasses on your liberty. And it's just really interesting to me that the people that seem to have like had the least experience of ever having their bodies policed have had the hardest time wearing a mask, right? Women and people who are identified as BIPOC have had their bodies policed. They're like always, right? And so like when you think about the mask as what it's holding in, right, and what it's protecting us from, and then you think about this kind of like fear or anger around the mask, like this is an amazing teachable moment. The mask
Absolutely.
the mask is like, it's the ubiquitous object of
Yeah.
COVID. It is so multivalent. It is so reflective of the fissures in our society, but it's also like about identity. I mean, there's so many ways that I think that we can work with objects to sort of remind ourselves that we can show empathy and compassion and love and justice in the same plane. And I feel like we fall down, I don't know, I feel like I'm challenged there as a white woman and educator to sort of not fall down there, right? Like I really feel like we are being called to put things into conceptual planes that we've kept separate.
Mhm.
And it's like something about this experience, this global shared experience, the intimacy of me being able to see into all your rooms, right? But also this great flattening and this great distancing that sort of locks us into our separate spaces. Like I don't know precisely, Christina, how we do this, but I do know that if we are kind of thinking creatively and also being willing to accept that all of this stuff has been running into each other all year,
Yeah.
right? It's all
Yeah.
intermingled now. Like we really have an opportunity to rewrite the rules.
I think we have a huge opportunity, and I think the mask is a really interesting point. I was thinking about that earlier too, that is the ultimate symbol of this pandemic on so many levels. And you can even say, look at it in terms of, it started as a medical mask, and there were shortages, and then it became a little cottage industry, and then it became the Etsy success story for some people. I mean, it's been sort of fascinating to see that something that started in one way has turned into this whole other kind of thing in and of itself. So I do think the mask is a really interesting common point that a lot of educators and writers can use as a starting place to talk about it. So I think having an artifact, I think even if it's the same one, a mask will tell 100 different stories, right? But I think the advantage of having something to work from is that it does focus the story a little bit, and it also opens it up to all kinds of different places. And as you said, if you look back on this year, that everything was crashing into everything. So I think the mask is a great place to start any kind of project discussion.
I was also thinking about the just Sandra, back to your sharing about your family stories, like the I mean, families are complex, and there's lots of different iterations of family and everything, but that you were able to tell collective stories together. You were able to work together. And I'm wondering also how, like, in schools, we so often, we separate the grades and we separate the ages and we separate the families, like, and so there's been this moment. So I've told the story, but my colleague Robert talked about, what was really fascinating to him at the beginning of the pandemic was that, like, he's bilingual and he would speak Spanish to his kids from time to time, depending on what they were doing. And when he was speaking Spanish, the parents would suddenly like peek around the computer, because they're like, who's this guy speaking Spanish? and that there was this like connection that he just hadn't really been able to build before. So and he was just wondering where to go with that. That was his question early in the pandemic. Like, there's this interesting thing that's happening. Like, the families are right there. They're like sometimes in the same room, in the same space with each other, back to back or whatever. So I was just, I don't know, that's another piece that I think is interesting and I'm not sure exactly how to approach it really, because everybody's story is going to be really different. And some people are a little bit more, less connected or not, but there is this thing about home, maybe is a center, or that surfaces, that also could be sort of a point of departure.
Yeah, I think about, a quilt, if you will, and I'm a fan of quilts. And so these different pieces, right, that could come together to tell the family's story, right, of what's happening with them right now. It's just, it really is. It's interesting. You mentioning family just reminds me that the weather here is beautiful this week, and I had my kids out in the park getting some fresh air, which once again has become a challenge, just physical activity in this space of isolation. But my daughter saw her fifth grade teacher in person for the very first time when we were out walking. And we're near the end of this school year, right? So that's one of those moments where this is such an unusual time that's the part of my heart that says we have to somehow hold on to the uniqueness of this moment. And we're trying to find ways to do that, both as individuals, back to what you said, Claudia, and as a family, but as part of a global family as well. And so it just, it's such an interesting time, Just made a connection, not really a question, but just made a connection with what you shared there.
Yeah, those relationships are so important. Maybe we should sort of move towards wrapping up this conversation. And I'd love to hear some sort of like final thoughts and stuff people are coming away with, or any more implications that you might be holding on to, especially as you're thinking about your own practice forward, something like that. I wanted to say that over the next month or so at the Writing Project, we if you follow us on social media, we're going to start just sharing more and more places that we know of where people are sharing stories and making things from this past year. So I just wanted to invite anybody listening to, share on social media and tag the Writing Project, and we could, sort of keep sharing, what are some things that you've created and that you've made, and what are some stories that you'd like to tell, and what are some ways that might inform what you want to do with your kids and how you want to think about supporting your writers forward. So I just want to invite that for anybody tapping in here. But why don't we open up the conversation again, just to, sort of start to move towards wrapping, and some final thoughts that you might be taking forward, some implications for your own practice, your own communities.
Oh, and I'll start. I think for me, I just want to think about my sphere of influence as an educator, as a mom, as a member of this community. just encouraging people to find their own way to capture their stories of what's happening to them now, but what has happened, what's transpired in their lives over the past year. So um, just connecting with the people once again within my sphere to encourage the sharing of those stories, including on the writing project social media sites. But because I just see such power in the therapy of story, I see reading and writing as, there's conversation about get the kids back in, let's help them deal with the trauma that they've been through over the past year. And no doubt there's been trauma for all of us, but I also see such power in reading and writing as a way to get us through that. And that gives me hope, and it encourages me to encourage others to see that that's another intersection, right? The academic side of this, reading and writing, getting back into the school space, can be supported, can be supportive of the therapeutic side of this and the healing side of this.
Thank you.
I don't have a clear plan yet, but I would love to find a way to formalize some of these ideas as some kind of a way to help teachers, students, be able to have a way to share their story, to create their stories and share their stories. And I think that it would be wonderful to collect as many and hear from as many sort of younger writers, developing writers, and get their voices heard as part of this, because their stories are so important. So how to do that and all of that, I do not right this minute have an answer, but I would love to be part of some effort to do that. And maybe this is an opening for some kids who have been reluctant to write and share their stories to be able to do so in some form. And it could be in Sandra's example of a photo voice, and there's so many ways to tell a story also, which I think is really, a great takeaway from Sandra's project. So. And send someone a vegetable, please.
I think I just want to say that I think a lot of people living on the planet, ourselves included, have exercised great courage in the face of the unknown and the unknowable. And your comments about things being out of our control, it really kind of resonate for me. And there's like this idea that like playing with the ways the story can be told, and the idea of boundaries and boundarylessness really makes me think about that maybe we can come out of this with a different relationship towards the concept of the boundary, right? Not to say the boundaries shouldn't exist, because they should, but maybe we all can have a different relationship with the question, what is a productive boundary? And that can have to do with genre, and that can have to do with private versus public, and that can have to do with lots and lots of things. But I think that I individually and as an educator and as a citizen, I think that somehow I've just accepted the fact of boundaries that other people have set for me or on my behalf without ever really kind of thinking about them. And I really think that COVID has thrown all that up in the air. And I just want us to, I just want us to do something new. So that's what I come away with from this conversation with, really.
I love that. And
I do too. I really love that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm coming away with the conversation again, the power of objects, actually, I think is really interesting, and something to continue to meditate on, I was thinking about, but like the power of creating and making, and to figure out those boundaries, to figure out what's possible, where can we, what could we do here that maybe isn't obvious, and that experience over and over, where you write and you realize halfway down, or halfway through creating something, and you're like, oh, that's what you like learn it through doing it.
Right.
And so really getting back to that, and really supporting us as writing teachers to think about, okay, how do we create those spaces and places in the months ahead? These are going to be critical spaces for
and
us.
not diluting everything with worksheets and as Margaret, like, let's not go backwards and kind of dumb this down and sort of pull out the old the old formats and just apply it to a new situation. I think the idea of something new, which is why I can't completely articulate a plan, but that was so beautifully said, is this idea of how do we give voice to this, and how do we help people find their voices in this, in ways that haven't been necessarily tried and true, but please do not pull out the old
Yeah, we have to make it
tired
exist. Yeah. So I hate to end this conversation, but I'm so thankful to have this time to share with all of you, to see what you've been making. I actually just love the artifacts that you all shared. We're gonna we'll share with this broadcast. We have the slide deck that we put together with a little bit more information about each of us, and then and you can see the objects again and some of our thoughts on them. And again, we'd love to hear from others about these ideas. And so please tag the Writing Project on social media, and share with us what you've been creating and what you might be planning for in the months ahead. So thank you so much, and have a lovely evening.
You're listening to NWP Radio, a production of the National Writing Project.
NWP. NWP Radio.